did this. It's happened to every single one of them between about 45 seconds and 90 seconds, about the longest they would burn. Now, there was something really wrong with this. And I remember the victims had been abducted from a Clark station in Homewood, primarily a white suburb, taken to all black, mostly black, 99.9% black, East Chicago Heights, it was then called. And the crime had taken place in an abandoned townhouse. It was, the first time I went to the Clark station, I looked, and here was a huge poster advertising big lighters. My God, that's where they got the idea from this poster. That must be how they got the idea. I don't really know if that's true, but indeed, ultimately, the 4 male defendants in this case were exonerated by DNA, which implicated the actual killers who also confessed. And Paula Gray, whose confession had been coerced, was exonerated ultimately as well. She had recanted the confession after she'd gotten out. But I'll tell you a little story about this case. There was I wrote this story, and I had discovered that the attorney who represented them had been under investigation by the Attorney Registration Disciplinary Commission for commingling funds from clients at the exact time he was trying this capital case, and he failed to respond to a subpoena from the Attorney Registration Disciplinary Commission during a trial, and he simply responded later, told the ARDC that the reason he hadn't responded is he was under incredible pressure, financial pressure, and was threatened with losing his house. Well, the Illinois Supreme Court had already affirmed the convictions of Dennis Williams and Kenny Adams and Willie Range, 3 of the defendants. The charges against the 4th defendant here had been dropped before trial because Paula Gray's testimony was the only thing that implicated them, and she recanted. They had a phony eyewitness who identified the others and Paula Gray, but not Vernil Jamerson in his initial statements. So Paula Gray was put on trial with them, sentenced to 50 years in prison for charged with perjury. She was charged with an accessory murder, sentenced to 50 years and 10 years for perjury to be served concurrently. When Dennis Williams and Willie Range got their case reversed, the prosecutors went back to see Paula Gray in prison and said, in essence, how would you like to get out? If you would, basically, here are the keys to your cell. All you have to do is testify against these guys who committed this crime. She'd been in prison now for 6 years. She really wanted out, and she was under tremendous pressure, and she agreed. And at this point, she testifies that Vernil was a participant in the crime. He'd been dismissed earlier. They now indict him. He's sentenced to death. Then they retried Willie Range and Dennis Williams and sentenced them to their previous sentences. And you can imagine how I felt about that at that point. We had set out here, we had one innocent man on death row, and now, thanks to my good work, we had 2 innocent people on death row. That was not a good situation. But ultimately, the story turned out very well, or as well as it could turn out. They were exonerated by DNA. The men got a $36 million settlement from Cook County. That's the largest civil rights settlement for a wrongful conviction in history. And Paula Gray later got a $2.6 million settlement for the way the police had treated her and coerced her confession. So not only is this system sending the wrong people to prison, which is something that we morally must be concerned about, and leaving the right people on the street to commit more crimes, and then it's costing the taxpayers millions and millions of dollars. We have now documented with a study that we did with the Better Government Association, more than $250 million in taxpayers' funds have been expended as a result of wrongful convictions. And there's untold murder and mayhem that was caused by the guilty people who remained on the street. So this is a very serious problem. Now, as Bethany told you, we had 288 men and women, 5 of the latter, by the way, sentenced to death in this state after the death penalty was restored following the United States Supreme Court's decision in Furman versus Georgia, which had overturned all existing state death penalty laws, not on the grounds that the death penalty was unconstitutional, but on the grounds that it was being applied in an arbitrary, capricious, wanton, freakish, and racially discriminatory manner. Therefore, there were no standards and it was unconstitutional. That didn't close the door to states reenacting new death penalty statutes, and 37 of them ultimately did. Under our statute, which was enacted in 1977, these 288 had been sentenced to death by the time George Ryan cleared out death row in 2003, and they had been in the peak. At the peak, the greatest year, we sentenced 21 people to death. After 2003, and after George Ryan had cleared out death row, and prosecutors got concerned about how this was looking, the pace of death penalty, of death sentences fell off rather abruptly. We were getting only 1 or 2 per year, as opposed to 15 to 20 in the years prior to that. So this was a very good situation. But one of the legislature's response to the disclosure of the problems in capital cases, Randy was the 18th Illinois exonerated. We've had 2 since then, so now we have 20 who've been on death row. The legislature approved what was called the Capital Litigation Trust Fund that would support forensic testing and investigation in capital cases by both the prosecution and the defense. Most of the money wound up going to the prosecution, by the way. But in this period of time, after the legislature passed this, we had sentenced a total of 13 people to death, and we had expended from the Capital Litigation Trust Fund $120 million. Do the math. I mean, this is the amount of money we are spending to maintain a death penalty, which we weren't going to use anyway. We were going to overturn most of these convictions eventually anyway. But we kept them. And that's what really created the momentum that enabled the legislature to finally abolish the death penalty and Governor Quinn to sign it. Now, I must tell you that this would not have happened without Randy Steidl. And the House sponsor, Kwame told you what he did in the Senate. The House sponsor, Karen Yarrow, when it passed the House, she turned to Randy in the gallery and said, "I did this for you." That's why we abolished the death penalty. And it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, former client of the Center for Wrongful Convictions, Randy Steidl.
I was just a spoken illegal that got that abolition done. I was just one person. A lot of good people made that happen. But I want to thank Roosevelt University, and specifically the Gage Gallery. I walked into this gallery. I look along the walls here, and it's very humbling for me. And I want you all to look at each one of these pictures because I see something that I'm sure the rest of you do. You see in their eyes the pain, the suffering, the torture that these innocent men and women went through for hundreds and hundreds of years combined. The eyes are the window to the soul. That's what I see. You see, I grew up in America where I believe that you stand tall, you tell the truth. If you make a mistake, you admit to it and you go on. I believe in America that does not torture or execute people. Sadly, that's not the case. In 1986, there was a gruesome murder of a young newlywed couple in Paris, Illinois. Small town, grew up there. It used to be a haven for some of the bootleg gangsters back in Capone's day. It used to be tales of shootouts, which actually happened on Hotel France, where a cop was killed. Well, I used to think that was just tales of lore of the old days until I realized that the underbelly of that town, 50, 60 years later, there was still a criminal element there. 6 weeks before July 6, 1986, Herb Wedlock and myself had reported to the FBI about the local prosecutor who was knowingly using drugs, protecting drug distribution, along with Karen Rhodes' employer. This was a very well-known prosecutor. He was a real party animal. You see, I realized that you stand up and you tell the truth to positions of power can get you in trouble. I realized this was the catalyst that was used to frame me for Dyke and Karen Rhodes' murder. I had a corroborated alibi, remains corroborated this very day. It was a small town. I was no choir boy, but I was an altar boy. Went to Catholic school. Had a rock-solid alibi. Told the truth, cooperated fully with the police. February 19, 1987, 7 months after the murders, there was a knock on my door. 5 police officers come in, throw me down, handcuff me, walk me out of my home. I had a 9-year-old son at the time that I was helping raise. My mom and dad was helping raise him. A 15-year-old daughter.